Hi folks, you're with Tacitus Today. Tacitus Today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the issue of family multi-generational living. This is relevant today because the cost of living is such in the West and been made so by the globalists. They've forced it on us without our consent and without our knowledge or foreknowledge. The cost of living is such that even someone on reliable income, the average wage slightly above, pretty much 2/3 of their income is being chewed up by even a modest one-bedroom apartment in the bigger cities like Sydney. And so they're living hand to mouth. I mean, they better not get sick or ill or lose their job or something like that. Otherwise, they'll be instantly in deep shit. But the economics of independent living have changed completely from, say, and I'll use 1970 as the baseline. In 1970, say if you wanted to rent a one-bedroom apartment, maybe not in downtown Sydney, but certainly in a commutable distance, you would pay somewhere between 15, certainly less than 20% of your income for a one-bedroom. Now that same one-bedroom apartment today, again, will take the exact same one. Will take up 2/3 of your average wage income, whereas it was, give or take 15% of your average wage income in 1970. So that's how drastic the huge change, monumental change in the economics of property in particular, but also food and transport. So the cost of petroleum, gasoline is in America. So these have drastically changed the economics. So it's quite possible for someone on the average wage, a job at a factory, even a job at like a grocery store or something like that, someone on the average wage to live independently, it could be done, and someone could do all right. I knew people when I was a kid who they both worked. The husband worked at a warehouse, the wife worked at a grocery store in the checkout, and they had enough money to buy a house, to have children, to have an annual vacation, and all this sort of stuff. So this is the change in economics. Now that change in economics has necessitated, and it's been forced on us, has necessitated a change in how we live, how we relate to one another. Now, family units in the West were changed. There's a couple of huge changes. There's one was the and this happened in two steps. One was the shift from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy, and you see this particularly, say, after the Civil War in the United States, in the 1880s, 1890s. People, say sons in particular, instead of staying on the farm, the family farm, would go to the city to get a job in a factory or something like that. So that, whereas hitherto the sons would stay on the farm and they become effectively farm labourers, they would inherit the farm and so on. And if you've been on a farm, there is always work to be done. So that those extra pair of hands from the children was something that was important and certainly useful to making the farm viable. Now, and also in the late 1800s, there was a lot of industrial machinery, harvesters and other machinery was starting to appear, and that was changing the nature of productivity. You just didn't need so many people as you needed previously. So those displaced people, in effect, or unneeded, in sense of unneeded labourers on the farm, they would be going to the cities. So you'd see the family splitting apart, and the city may be quite some distance from the farm. And given travelling, certainly in the 1880s, 1890s, unless you're on a railhead, travelling to go back to see your folks or the folks travelling to see the kids, it was a tough gig. It was time consuming and expensive. And so once you moved away a certain distance, then you wouldn't see so much of the family. So there was that. But again, you had, and this changed this was an attitude to what the family unit was. Following World War II and the boom, and again, using 1970 as the baseline when things were very, very affordable for anyone on an average wage, whether it be buying a house, paying rent, buying a car, buying a loaf of bread and so on. The purchasing power of the paycheck then was far greater than it is today on the average wage. So that change in economic circumstances meant that parents could say to children, children when they turned 18. This was before college became a mandatory sort of next step. So when kids finished high school, or at least became legal adults, 18 years old, the parents could say, well, off you go, make your own way in the world and grow up, be an adult, be a man, this, that, the next thing. And that's how it was. And I remember as a kid, it was quite rare to see, it happened, but it was quite rare to see children, 18, 19, 20, 21-year-old children still living with their folks. Again, it happened, but it just wasn't, it was comparatively rare. Now, it happened, say, children that would go to, assuming it was university, and the university was close to where the family house was. And so then they may stay during the university, or say they were doing some sort of cadetship or apprenticeship where it was accepted in return for substantial training and education, you would get a lower wage. And that type of trade-off was certainly prevalent again when I was first getting into the workforce. That was sort of how things were. But for the most part, people didn't stay. They were, they either wanted independence, and this was also a part of the free love thing. The idea of your parents may disapprove of you bringing a girlfriend or boyfriend home and engaging in intimate relations. So you got your own place, so you could do that without some sort of disapproving eye upon you. But there were effectively, people went out. Now, quite a few parents would go, would suddenly invent rules that the kid would have to, the young adult 18 would have to abide by, and these were high-handed sort of rules that the kid would go, I'm not doing that. Well, in that case, if you can't follow my rules, out you go. And there was quite a bit of that went on, and that actually soured relations. I know the kid his parents sort of suddenly introduced these heavy-handed rules that he had to abide by when he turned 18, and then say he had to pay an extortionate amount of board, and that was their way of saying, look, why don't you fuck off? So I took a dim view of that. Just knowing that was a buddy of mine from high school, and just knowing him, he took a very dim view of that. He never forgave his parents for that. And to them, it was, we showed him as boss. To them, who I knew the parents, I quite liked them, but I thought, you don't realize what you've just done. The bond that you had as parents, children, the bond that you had, that bond of trust and faith, you've broken it. And he, and I knew, I could see it even then. I said, he's never going to really forgive you for this. Sure, he may come around at Christmas and that, but he's never going to forgive you for this. So why do something that would have such unpleasant consequences, or is likely to have? But they expected, the parents expect, hey, it's our place. We can do that. I know it's your place. I know you can fucking do that. But consider the consequences of it. Now, the idea of family living and I noticed this, say, with Italian or Greek or whatever families, particularly people who'd come from poorer agricultural circumstances. They'd had rural farms in southern Italy, or rural, I don't know, olive groves or something in Greece, or whatever it might be. They tended to keep the kids at home. And I remember talking to one. This Italian guy that sort of, he was a work colleague actually at one point. He introduced me to his folks, and And the dad, who still had a bit of an Italian accent, he said, "Well, I didn't bring my kids up just to take money from them. I brought them up to and I want to give them a start in life. I want to help them. I want to, help them, make sure they're okay. And what if I die tomorrow? Da da da." And they took quite a different view of this, so as indeed did Arabs and that sort of thing. It was only at the time, and this is still the case, it was only the white Anglo-Saxon families said, "No, you get out and make your own way in the world. No, get out of the house, fuck off," and da 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 da. And didn't give them any help. And I noticed that again, other when the kid did leave home, maybe at 25 years old to get married, for example, maybe a bit younger, 23, typically getting married was the when they might move out, unless the house was quite big, and then they may have a section of the house for them, and that sort of thing. But and also because of that structure, they were really encouraged to marry into their own ethnic group. So those values of non-independence, family unit would be shared, and you can see why. There's a practical sort of aspect to it. Now, it was only the white kids that went out. So the white kids are burning money on rent and this, that, and the next thing, and whereas the brown or the light brown or the non-Anglo-Saxon anyway kids were in the house, staying in the house for longer. They didn't have to pay board. The parents were happy to have them there, happy to help them, happy to give them a leg up and this sort of thing. But the Anglo parents didn't. Now some Anglo parents did. Don't sort of get me wrong here, but not many did. Whereas the great majority of again, Greeks, Italians, that sort of stuff, they did help and did do everything they could. Not in every case, but certainly the majority that I noticed, to help the children get a start in life. Maybe it was, they're quite rigorous. I remember one, I don't think he was Greek, but his family were, "Well, look, you can stay here, you don't have to pay board, you don't have to do anything." And the parents even bought him a car, that sort of stuff. But the deal was he had to save every penny of his money, his income, to save up to buy a house so he could get married and have children, and so they could have grandchildren. So there was a thing about it. But also they were to live close by, so that when he did have children, he and his wife, if they needed to, could both go to work or whatever, and the grandparents would look after the children, pick them up from school and these sorts of things, so they didn't have to pay daycare. But more importantly, that the kids' children, they weren't going to be looked after by strangers that didn't really care about them. They were amongst family members who supposedly at least are supposed to love and care and cherish the grandkids and so on. So it's a very different family structure, and one that's quite beneficial. They also would often eat communally. So they would come around and there would be, say, given the children, the grandchildren, the grandmother would cook for 12 people, for example. And these sort of things are economies in food and in separation of labour. Someone's doing the cooking, so someone can do the working, so someone can do the childcare, so this sort of thing. And economically, it made a difference. Now, those people did it through tradition, and because they wanted to be helpful, they wanted the family close to them, and the purchasing power of the paycheck at the time meant that the white kids could go out and they could get by. It wasn't the end of the world. Maybe they could have done better by staying, with their parents in the family, but they could get out and they could do okay, because the purchasing power of the average wage was just so huge at the time. So if you're renting an apartment and you're paying 15% or so on rent of your income on rent, then there's still a lot of latitude to save and to get ahead and to get a deposit to buy a house that was, of course, far more affordable then than it is today. A house that was $70,000 in even 1985, $70,000 in 1985 is today, well over $2 million. To give you just some sort of idea of how much appreciation has been in residential real estate. So coming back to the issue now of affordability, looking at the even now, even today, somewhere around 10% of children over the age of 25, white children over the age of 25, are still living with their parents. Now, some of this maybe they're not all getting on. There's been a lot of divorces today relative to, so where are your parents? They've probably got two separate households rather than one. They're economically struggling because they divorced and blew all their money on the cost of divorce and that sort of thing. So there are economic differences today, not only in cost of living but in family economic circumstances generally. Divorce was rare and unheard of back then. I remember at school there was, maybe out of 1,000 kids, there was 2 or 3 that were from divorced households. That's how rare it was then. I mean, today the rarity. I've got some business associates and so on. Every single one of them is divorced. Like, it's not one looking at half a dozen plus there. So very different landscape today. Wealth, of course, it's had no practical, useful purpose at all for Western civilization. Quite the opposite. Nonetheless, when we look at family structures and the cost of getting by, if you're living with your parents, assuming that's even feasible and they're still together, but if you're living with your parents and then you get married, have children, and even if you live in the household, or even if you live close by and your parents can do the child minding, again, the picking up from school, maybe your parents cook sort of bulk food and then bring it over to you, so you don't have to worry about cooking or having to get takeout food or something. So that those logistics are taken care of, which are time consuming. The cooking, the driving to the school, dropping them off, picking them up, and taking care of them afterwards, and that sort of thing. But it changes. It very considerably changes the economic circumstances of the family. But only 10% of, give or take, I mean, in some places it's 15%, some places it's 4%, but give or take 10% thereabouts of Anglo families are actually staying in some sort of cohesive unit. Whereas if you look at the Latin families of South America, when you look at Indians, Chinese, Pakistanis and whatever, then they stay together in family units in far more of them. Like there's sometimes 3 or 4 generations are still there, assuming they procreate at a young enough age. But also you can throw in things like cousins and the like. And so they can exist in large family houses that have 6 bedrooms, 3 kitchens and 4 bathrooms and so on. And so they can stay in quite large, wider family units, but in one household. I mean, you'd have to be good at getting on with people, I suppose, if you and the elder of the family has to arbitrate petty disputes and so on. But nonetheless, from an economic perspective, you can do much better living that way. You're not spending multiple lots of rent or multiple lots of mortgage, or you're not buying multiple separate lots of food, cooking separately. You're not paying someone to look after your kids in daycare and so on and so forth. So the economic benefits are clear and obvious. But white people are much less. And I think white people haven't just adjusted to what's the new cost of living reality. Now, this gives an advantage to Indians and Chinese. In other words, where you look at household wealth there, Indian household wealth is across the West generally is outstripping the household wealth of white people. Not because Indians are working hard or doing more, or they're brighter or this or that or anything like that, but that they've got many more income earners under the one roof. That's all it is. And that they can amortize their cost of living across many more people, and one bulk cooking and not having to pay for daycare. If I look at the white people I know that have got children, they're working, they're all paying for daycare. And the cost of day, it's not cheap. So that's money straight out of their pocket for something that, in the case of the Indians and the Chinese and the Hispanics and so on, where relatives are doing that. And so I think that sort of wider family community living is what's going to be needed to survive. The number of jobs in the West that pay enough money for people to live independently and have children, very important, and have children. The number of jobs is now 1 in 20 that can facilitate that, and that's declining. Whereas if you have multiple income earners in the house across generations, then it becomes much more feasible, which is why, you know, brown and black people, Arabic people are out producing white people by 3 times, and so on. So this is now again, this has been forced on us, but the idea of the purchasing power of the paycheck being so good that people could, you know, leave home at 18 and still do quite well for themselves, those days are gone, completely gone. And unless white society readjusts to the new reality, or we kick out the useless globalist governments that have forced this cost of living crisis upon us, you know, one of the two has to give. But nonetheless, the convulsions, as in the social convulsions of, you know, how to live together, how to get by, the cost of living, these are the new realities that have to be faced. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.